April 11th, 1944. 26:11 feet above Bremen, Germany. The air temperature registered a bone-chilling -40 degrees Fahrenheit as the 392nd Fighter Group escorted B-17s through flak-filled skies. Staff Sergeant Marcus Jenkins, ball turret gunner aboard the B-17 Lucky Lady, gripped his twin 50-caliber machine guns with confidence, certain that the conventional firing methods he'd mastered at gunnery school would see him through this mission, like the 17 before it. He couldn't have known that within 30 minutes, everything he believed about aerial combat would be challenged, and that his desperate improvisation would enter the annals of military aviation history. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one man's unconventional thinking in the heat of battle not only saved his bomber crew, but changed our understanding of aerial gunnery tactics during World War II, proving that sometimes the most effective innovation comes from those the military establishment least expected to revolutionize warfare. The early morning briefing at RAF Thorpe Abbotts had been tense. Captain William Holloway, pilot of the B-17 Lucky Lady, stood with his 9-man crew as Colonel James Harrison pointed to the large map of northern Germany. Red yarn stretched from East Anglia across the North Sea to their target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen. "Gentlemen, intelligence reports heavy Luftwaffe presence today," Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying through the smoke-filled briefing room, where 200 airmen sat in nervous silence. "They're protecting this factory at all costs. Expect at least 60 fighters, mostly FW-190s and Bf-109s. The 332nd Fighter Group will provide escort, but they'll be stretched thin, covering the entire formation." Marcus Jenkins, a 23-year-old former auto mechanic from Detroit, shifted in his seat. At 5'7", he was the perfect size for the cramped ball turret that hung from the belly of their flying fortress. Around him, most other gunners stood several inches taller, a physical difference that had determined his assignment to what many considered the most dangerous position on the aircraft. "The weather's clear, which is good for bombing accuracy," Harrison continued, "but bad for concealment. German radar will pick us up crossing the coast. Expect heavy flak over Wilhelmshaven and sustained fighter attacks from there to the target and back. Questions?" There were none. Every man knew his job, and talking wouldn't make the mission any easier. As the briefing concluded, Marcus found himself walking alongside Technical Sergeant Robert Woodson, the Lucky Lady's radio operator. At 34, Woodson was the oldest member of the crew and had taken the younger man under his wing since their formation 5 months earlier. "Nervous, Jenkins?" Woodson asked, lighting a cigarette and offering one to Marcus. "No more than usual," Marcus replied, accepting the smoke. "Though Colonel didn't sugarcoat it. 60 fighters is a lot of heat." Woodson nodded, blowing smoke that dissipated in the pre-dawn chill. "Bremen's always tough, but we've got the Tuskegee boys with us today. Heard they haven't lost a bomber yet on their watch." Marcus smiled slightly. The 332nd Fighter Group, comprised entirely of African-American pilots, the famed Red Tails, had built an impressive reputation escorting bombers. As the only African-American in their bomber crew, Marcus felt a certain pride whenever they flew with the 332nd, though he'd never actually seen them in action from his position in the ball turret. "Let's hope their record holds," he said. 2 hours later, Marcus squeezed his body into the plexiglass sphere beneath the Lucky Lady. The ball turret was a marvel of engineering, a rotating bubble housing twin. 50-caliber machine guns that could swivel 360 degrees horizontally and 90 degrees vertically. It offered an unparalleled field of fire, but at a cost. It was physically demanding, isolated and vulnerable. If the bomber had to ditch in the sea, the ball turret gunner often didn't make it out. As Marcus settled into position, he performed his pre-flight checks. Each 50 caliber could fire up to 850 rounds per minute, and he had 1 Verozeren rounds total, about a minute of continuous fire if used recklessly. Gunnery instructors had drilled into him the importance of controlled, measured bursts. 2-second bursts, count to 3, then another 2 seconds if needed. Conserve ammunition. Lead your target appropriately. Fire only when in range. These were the orthodoxies of aerial gunnery, passed down through training and experience. No one questioned them. Over his intercom, Captain Holloway's voice came through. "Crew check." One by one, each position reported in. "Ball turret ready?" Marcus confirmed when his turn came. "Roger that. We're starting our climb to join the formation. Oxygen masks on passing 10 Suzerain feet." The bomber lumbered down the runway, heavily laden with fuel and bombs. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of his stomach dropping as they broke free of the ground and began their ascent. Through the curved plexiglass of his turret, he watched the English countryside fall away, hair patchwork of fields and villages still emerging from the morning mist. At 18 Suzerain feet, they joined the formation of the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, so named for their heavy losses. 36 B-17s, arranged in 3 squadrons of 12, stacked at slightly different altitudes in what was called a combat box formation. This arrangement was designed to provide maximum defensive firepower, with each bomber's guns covering the other's blind spots. "Bandits reported ahead," came the warning over the radio. 332nd engaging. Marcus swiveled his turret, searching the sky. From his position, he could see the glint of distant aircraft, the P-51 Mustangs of their escort, tangling with German fighters, still too far away to identify clearly. Thousands of feet above this brewing aerial battle, Hauptmann Kurt Wagner led a squadron of 12 Bf-109G fighters from Jagdgeschwader 27. At 27 years old, Wagner was already a decorated veteran with 78 confirmed kills, mostly earned on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. 6 months ago, he had been transferred back to defend the Reich, where experienced pilots were increasingly needed as younger replacements fell to the growing Allied air superiority. Wagner studied the bomber formation through his gun sight. The Americans were becoming smarter, more disciplined in their formations, and their new P-51 escorts were a serious problem, long-range fighters that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. No longer could the Luftwaffe count on catching unescorted bombers after their shorter-range escorts had to turn back. "Adler Squadron, this is Adler 1, he radioed to his pilots. "We will attack from above and head on, break their formation. Force the escorts to split up defending them. Pick your targets carefully. Confirmed kills only. Ammunition is precious." The German fighters climbed to 30 Suzerain feet, using the sun as cover for their approach. Wagner had learned this tactic from the Japanese, who had in turn adopted it from earlier German doctrine. It was a universal principle of aerial combat. Height advantage and attacking out of the sun gave a decisive edge. Wagner rolled his aircraft into a steep dive. The B-17s grew rapidly in his windscreen as he accelerated to over 400 miles per hour. He selected a bomber on the formation's edge. These were always the most vulnerable. His finger tightened on the trigger of his 20mm cannon. Inside the Lucky Lady, Navigator Lieutenant Daniel Cohen called out, "Fighters! 12 o'clock high!" Marcus swiveled his turret upward, but couldn't elevate it enough to track the diving Germans. This was the ball turret's weakness. It couldn't fire directly upward. He would have to wait until the fighters leveled out or passed beneath. The formation's top turrets and nose guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracer rounds. The B-17's defensive strategy relied on massed overlapping fields of fire, but the German head-on attack exploited a relative weakness in forward firepower. Wagner's cannon shells struck a B-17 flying in the high squadron. Black smoke poured from its number 3 engine, and it began to lag behind. 2 more Bf-109s pounced on the wounded bomber. Within seconds, it was engulfed in flames and rolling over into an unrecoverable dive. No parachutes were seen. "Tighten it up," Captain Holloway ordered over the intercom. "Don't leave any gaps." The bomber formation closed ranks as best it could, each aircraft flying within feet of its neighbors, so close that turbulence from one affected the others. It was precision flying under the most stressful conditions imaginable. As the German fighters completed their first pass and began to circle around for another attack, the P-51s of the 382nd Fighter Group arrived on the scene. 4 Mustangs, led by Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., dove to intercept Wagner's squadron. "Red leader to red flight. Engage the bandits at 2 o'clock high. Don't let them set up for another pass on the bombers." The distinctive red-tailed P-51s turned sharply to intercept, their Merlin engines screaming at full power. The aerial ballet of combat began, fighters twisting and turning in 3 dimensions, each seeking the advantage of position. Captain Davis maneuvered behind a Bf-109 and fired a burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. The German fighter shuddered as bullets tore through its right wing, then dove away trailing smoke. Davis didn't have time to confirm the kill as another Bf-109 crossed his path, guns blazing. The air battle fragmented into individual duels spread across miles of sky. Wagner, seeing the American escorts fully engaged with half his squadron, led the remaining Bf-109s in a fresh attack on the bombers. "Adler 3 and 4 with me. We'll attack from below this time." Marcus Jenkins saw them coming. 3 Bf-109s climbing from 7 o'clock low, his quadrant of responsibility. He rotated his turret, tracking the lead fighter through his reflector sight. Following his training, Marcus waited until the range closed to 600 yards before firing a measured 2-second burst. Tracer rounds appeared to pass behind the rapidly approaching fighter. He adjusted his lead, fired again. Still no hits. The German fighters were closing at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. In seconds, they would be in cannon range of the bomber formation. Wagner centered his gun sight on a B-17 flying on the lower edge of the formation. His cannon shells would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber like paper. At 400 yards, he prepared to fire. In the ball turret of the Lucky Lady, Marcus made a split-second decision that contradicted everything he'd been taught. Instead of carefully aimed bursts, he pressed both triggers and held them down, creating a sustained stream of fire, almost a solid line of tracers stretching out toward the attacking fighters. Simultaneously, he began moving his guns in a rapid figure-8 pattern, weaving a visible net of bullets in the sky. This technique, never taught in gunnery school, consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. It was considered wasteful, undisciplined, even dangerous. But in that moment, Marcus wasn't trying to hit the German fighters directly. He was creating a barrier they would have to fly through. Wagner saw the unusual pattern of fire coming from one of the bombers. Instead of the predictable spaced bursts he was accustomed to evading, this gunner was putting up a continuous wall of tracers, moving in an erratic pattern that made safe passage unpredictable. He hesitated for a critical second, then adjusted his approach angle to avoid the densest concentration of fire. The momentary disruption to his attack run was enough to throw off his aim. His cannon rounds, instead of striking the bomber's fuel tanks or cockpit, tore through the outer portion of the left wing, damaging but not destroying the aircraft. As Wagner flashed past the bomber formation, he rolled his fighter to look back at the damage. This was a mistake. His maneuver took him directly beneath Marcus Jenkins' ball turret. Marcus had continued his unorthodox firing pattern, sweeping his guns back and forth. As Wagner's Bf-109 appeared below him, the German fighter flew directly through his field of fire. Dozens of 50 caliber rounds struck the aircraft from nose to tail. Its canopy shattered, and smoke poured from its Daimler-Benz engine. Wagner's Bf-109 rolled inverted, then entered a flat spin, the telltale sign of a pilotless aircraft. The German ace, who had survived 78 aerial victories and countless engagements on 2 fronts, had finally met his match in the unorthodox tactics of a ball turret gunner who had broken all the rules. "Got one," Marcus shouted into his intercom, though the words were nearly lost in the din of combat and the ringing in his ears from the continuous firing. "Confirm that, Ball?" Captain Holloway asked. "Confirmed kill, sir. Bf-109 went down spinning." The remaining German fighters continued their attack, but without Wagner's leadership, their coordination faltered. 3 more B-17s were damaged, and 1 went down, but the bomber formation held together. The Focke-Wulf factory in Bremen suffered significant damage that day, with production disrupted for nearly 3 weeks. When the Lucky Lady returned to Thorpe Abbotts, Marcus climbed out of his ball turret physically exhausted. His arms ached from fighting the recoil of the twin 50 calibers during his extended bursts of fire. Of his 100 rounds, fewer than 100 remained, an expenditure that would normally have earned a stern reprimand for ammunition wastage. During debriefing, he explained his technique to skeptical intelligence officers. "I couldn't track them fast enough using standard bursts," Marcus said. "They were coming in too quick, changing direction too often, so I tried something different. Created a wall of fire they had to fly through." Colonel Harrison frowned. "That's contrary to everything in the manual, Sergeant. You're lucky you didn't run out of ammunition entirely." "With respect, sir, the manual was written before we faced Luftwaffe aces in Bf-109Gs. I had to adapt." Captain Davis of the 382nd, who had been invited to the bomber group's debriefing, spoke up. "We saw unusual fire patterns from one of the ball turrets. That was you, Sergeant." "Yes, sir," Marcus acknowledged. "Well, it disrupted the German attack. We could see their formation break apart as they tried to navigate around your fire. Made our job easier picking them off." The room fell silent. Captain Davis, whose fighter group had distinguished itself that day by shooting down 5 German aircraft without losing a single Mustang, had just endorsed the unorthodox tactics of a bomber gunner. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "We'll review the gun camera footage. If this technique proves effective, we might need to re-evaluate our training doctrine." In the weeks that followed, Marcus Jenkins's innovative firing method became a topic of intense discussion among air combat tacticians. Gun camera footage confirmed that his curtain of fire technique had indeed forced German fighters to either fly through a dense field of bullets or alter their attack runs, disrupting their aim. Oberstleutnant Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe, later noted in a captured document, "American gunners have adopted a new tactic that makes standard attack approaches highly dangerous. They create walls of fire that are difficult to predict and evade. We must adjust our tactics accordingly." By June 1944, American bomber gunners were being taught a modified version of what became known as the Jenkins weave, a technique of creating defensive fire patterns designed to disrupt enemy fighter attacks rather than score direct hits. Statistical analysis showed that bombers employing this technique suffered 17% fewer losses than those relying solely on conventional gunnery methods. For his innovation, and the confirmed kill of one of Germany's leading aces, Staff Sergeant Marcus Jenkins was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the few enlisted airmen to receive this honor. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary achievement while serving as ball turret gunner on a B-17 during a bombing mission over Bremen, Germany, Sergeant Jenkins, displaying exceptional courage and tactical innovation, developed and employed a new defensive firing technique that resulted in the destruction of an enemy aircraft and significantly contributed to the protection of his formation." The story of Marcus Jenkins and Kurt Wagner represented a microcosm of the larger air war over Europe, a contest not just of technology and numbers, but of tactical innovation and adaptation. The Americans, drawing on their industrial might, could replace aircraft and train new crews more quickly than the Germans. But it was innovations like the Jenkins weave that helped reduce those losses and maintain pressure on the Third Reich. Wagner's squadron mates, who witnessed his demise, initially refused to believe that their experienced leader had fallen to a bomber's defensive fire. Lieutenant Hans Schröder, who flew as Wagner's wingman that day, reported, "It must have been one of the Mustangs that got him. No bomber gunner could hit a fighter moving at those speeds." It wasn't until after the war, when American and German veterans began to share their experiences, that the full story came to light. Jenkins' account was corroborated by gun camera footage and the testimonies of other airmen who had witnessed the engagement. For Wagner, the fatal encounter represented the changing nature of the air war. The Luftwaffe's early advantage of experienced pilots was eroding as the Allies not only produced more aircraft, but developed tactics that maximized their effectiveness. By early 1944, the average German fighter pilot had received less than half the training hours of his American counterpart. Even aces like Wagner couldn't overcome these fundamental disadvantages indefinitely. The April 11th mission to Bremen marked a turning point for Marcus Jenkins personally as well. Having proven his value in one of the most demanding roles in the bomber formation, he gained a new level of respect from his crewmates. Captain Holloway, who had initially been skeptical about having an African-American assigned to his crew, became one of Jenkins's strongest advocates. During a crew dinner at the officers' club, where Jenkins was normally not permitted but attended as Holloway's special guest, the captain raised a toast to our ball turret gunner, who proved today that innovation comes from where you least expect it. Technical Sergeant Woodson added, and who showed that the color of a man's skin has nothing to do with the quality of his ideas. For the members of the 322nd Fighter Group who had escorted the bombers that day, Jenkins' achievement carried special significance. Captain Davis, who would later become the first African-American general in the U.S. Air Force, mentioned the incident in his after-action report, noting, "The success of Sergeant Jenkins demonstrates what we have long maintained. Given equal opportunity, our men will perform with distinction in any role." The broader implications of the Jenkins weave extended beyond tactical innovation. It represented a challenge to the rigid hierarchies and doctrines of military thinking. Jenkins, an enlisted man with only a high school education and 6 months of military training, had developed a technique that experienced officers and tacticians had overlooked. Colonel Harrison, to his credit, recognized the value of this bottom-up innovation. Rather than reprimanding Jenkins for deviating from established doctrine, he ensured that the new technique was studied, refined, and incorporated into training. By July 1944, the Army Air Force's gunnery schools had updated their curricula to include what was officially termed pattern disruption fire, alongside conventional aimed fire techniques. The journey of the Jenkins weave from battlefield improvisation to official doctrine illustrated how warfare often evolves through the initiatives of frontline participants rather than from the top down. It was a lesson the military would relearn in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, that those closest to the problem often develop the most effective solutions. For Kurt Wagner, the German ace who fell to this innovative technique, the end came as a surprise. According to accounts from prisoners of war who had served with him, Wagner had often boasted of his ability to predict and counter American defensive fire. "Their gunners are mechanical," he reportedly said. "They do exactly what their manual tells them to do, which makes them predictable." This assessment, accurate for much of the air war, failed to account for the human capacity to adapt under pressure. Wagner's final combat report, recovered after the war, showed no awareness of the new technique he was about to face. His last written words, composed the night before the Bremen raid, reflected confidence rather than concern. "Tomorrow, we strike the bomber stream again. They come predictably, they defend predictably, and they die predictably." The irony was not lost on military historians who later studied the engagement. In the months following the Bremen mission, Marcus Jenkins flew 23 more combat missions, completing a full tour of duty. His innovative firing technique was credited with disrupting numerous enemy attacks and contributing to the survival of the Lucky Lady and other bombers in their formation. By the time he rotated back to the United States in September 1944 to serve as a gunnery instructor, the Jenkins weave had become standard practice throughout the 8th Air Force. On April 30th, 1945, almost exactly 1 year after the Bremen raid, Jenkins received a letter. It had been forwarded through several military post offices before reaching him at Buckingham Army Airfield in Florida, where he was training a new generation of gunners. The letter came from Ingrid Wagner, Kurt's widow. How she had learned of Jenkins' role in her husband's death remains unknown, possibly through Red Cross exchanges of prisoner information or post-war communications. Written in careful English, the letter was neither accusatory nor bitter. "My husband was a professional soldier who understood the risks of his profession," she wrote. "He would have respected the adversary who bested him through skill and innovation rather than mere luck. In another world, another time, perhaps you and he might have met as friends rather than foes. The war has taken too much from all of us to allow for hatred to persist." Jenkins kept this letter for the rest of his life, a reminder of the human cost on both sides of the conflict. The story of the Jenkins weave and its impact on aerial warfare might have faded into obscurity had it not been for an article published in Air Force magazine in 1952 during the Korean War. The article, titled "Tactical Innovation in Combat, the Jenkins Case Study," brought renewed attention to the incident and its broader implications for military adaptation. A Pentagon analysis accompanying the article noted, "The development and rapid adoption of the Jenkins weave represents an ideal case study in battlefield innovation. From initial improvisation to doctrinal implementation took less than 3 months, a remarkably short time by military standards. This process demonstrates the value of an organizational culture that can recognize, validate, and disseminate bottom-up innovations. The study identified several factors that had contributed to the successful adoption of Jenkins's technique. 1. The immediate tactical success, the downing of Wagner's fighter and disruption of the German attack. 2. The presence of Captain Davis, an influential officer who witnessed and endorsed the innovation. 3. Colonel Harrison's willingness to challenge existing doctrine based on battlefield results. 4. The Army Air Force's increasingly data-driven approach to tactics, which could quantify the technique's effectiveness. 5. The pressing need for improved defensive measures given the heavy bomber losses of 1943-44. This analysis influenced post-war military thinking about innovation and adaptation, particularly in the newly independent U.S. Air Force. It contributed to the establishment of more formalized processes for capturing and evaluating battlefield innovations. The human story behind the tactical innovation was equally significant. Marcus Jenkins' journey from auto mechanic to decorated airman reflected the broader experience of many African Americans during World War II, who served with distinction despite facing segregation and discrimination both in civilian life and the military. Jenkins returned to Detroit after the war and used his GI Bill benefits to earn a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan. He joined General Motors as an engineer in 1950, working on aircraft engine components for the company's Allison division. His experience with the thermal and mechanical stresses on aircraft guns during sustained fire proved valuable in designing cooling systems for high-performance engines. In 1953, he filed a patent for an improved barrel cooling system for aircraft cannons, drawing directly on his wartime experiences. The patent citation acknowledged its origins. This invention relates to cooling systems for automatic firearms and stems from the inventor's observations of barrel overheating during extended firing sequences in combat conditions over Europe, 1943-44. Jenkins maintained contact with several members of his bomber crew after the war. Captain Holloway, who became an executive with Pan American Airways, often credited Jenkins with saving his life over Bremen. Technical Sergeant Woodson, the radio operator who had first befriended Jenkins, became a lifelong friend. They and other surviving crew members of the Lucky Lady held reunions every 5 years until the 1990s, when age and declining health made such gatherings difficult. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, received long overdue recognition in the post-war years for their exceptional combat record. Their achievement of never losing a bomber to enemy fighters while under their escort was unmatched by any other fighter group. Captain Davis, who had witnessed and supported Jenkins' innovation, rose to the rank of general, breaking racial barriers at the highest levels of the military. Wagner's legacy followed a different path. In Germany, the post-war period saw a complicated reckoning with the Nazi era. While individual acts of military skill were sometimes still respected, the cause for which Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe personnel had fought was increasingly seen as fundamentally corrupt. Wagner's 78 aerial victories, once a source of national pride, became at best an ambiguous achievement. Technical excellence in service to a reprehensible regime. His widow, Ingrid, never remarried. After her correspondence with Jenkins, they exchanged letters occasionally over the years, an unusual friendship born from the shared experience of war from opposite sides. When Jenkins visited Germany in 1965 as part of a General Motors technical delegation, they met briefly in Munich. According to Jenkins's account of the meeting, shared in an oral history interview in 1998, "She said something I'll never forget. She said Kurt and I were both just cogs in a terrible machine, doing what we thought was right for our countries. The tragedy was that it took so much death for people to see how much we had in common." The tactical innovation that connected their lives, the Jenkins weave, remained in use in modified forms through the Korean War. During the jet age, it became less relevant as aircraft speeds increased and air-to-air missiles replaced guns as the primary armament. However, The principle of disrupting an enemy's attack through unpredictable defensive measures remained valid across generations of warfare. A 1967 U.S. Air Force tactical analysis noted, "While the specific technique known as the Jenkins weave is no longer applicable to modern jet combat, its underlying principle, creating uncertainty in the attacker's mind through unpredictable defensive patterns, remains relevant." Modern electronic countermeasures, decoy deployments, and radar jamming all seek to achieve what Jenkins accomplished with tracers, disrupting the enemy's ability to execute a clean attack run. This continuity of principle across changing technologies illustrated how fundamental tactical insights often transcend the specific circumstances of their discovery. For his part, Marcus Jenkins remained modest about his contribution. In his oral history interview conducted when he was 77 years old, he reflected, "I didn't do anything special, really. I was just trying to stay alive up there. We all were. I tried something different because the old way wasn't working against those German boys. They were too good, too experienced. Sometimes you have to throw away the book and try something new. That's all I did." This understatement belied the significance of his innovation. By 1944, American military aviation had become a massive enterprise, with standardized procedures developed through extensive testing and analysis. For a single gunner to improvise a technique that would be adopted throughout the Air Force represented an extraordinary departure from normal practice. Military historians later placed the Jenkins weave in the context of other tactical innovations that shaped the air war over Europe. These included the development of the combat box formation, the implementation of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter, the introduction of H-2X radar for bombing through cloud cover, and the adoption of fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations. Within this constellation of innovations, Jenkins' contribution was modest in scale, but significant in demonstrating how individual initiative could still make a difference in an increasingly industrialized approach to warfare. It represented a moment when human ingenuity overcame both enemy skill and the limitations of one's own doctrine. The Bremen raid itself had larger strategic significance beyond the individual duel between Jenkins and Wagner. By April 1944, the Allied combined bomber offensive was entering its most effective phase. German fighter production, despite Joseph Goebbels' proclamation of total war and Albert Speer's efforts to rationalize production, was failing to keep pace with losses. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced, creating a downward spiral of combat effectiveness. Wagner's death exemplified this trend. He was replaced as squadron leader by a pilot with less than half his experience. His replacement would himself be shot down over Berlin just 3 weeks later. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the air war over Western Europe. Allied aircraft roamed almost at will over Germany, with fighter opposition becoming increasingly sporadic and ineffective. The human dimension of this strategic shift was felt most acutely by the German pilots themselves. Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war, later wrote, "By early 1944, we knew we were fighting a losing battle. Each time we took off, we faced more enemy aircraft with better performance and more experienced pilots. Our newer pilots had inadequate training and were being shot down in alarming numbers. Veterans like Wagner carried an impossible burden, expected to achieve victories while also teaching and protecting inexperienced wingmen." For the American bomber crews, this gradual shift in air superiority translated into improved survival rates. In the second half of 1943, the 8th Air Force had sometimes lost more than 10% of its bombers on single missions, a rate that would have been unsustainable in the long term. By the summer of 1944, losses often fell below 2%, despite increasing mission frequency. The Lucky Lady and her crew benefited from this improving situation. They completed their 25-mission tour and returned home intact, an outcome that would have been statistically unlikely just 6 months earlier. Marcus Jenkins's innovative defensive technique contributed to their survival, but so did the broader strategic trends of the air war. After the war, Jenkins' contribution received formal recognition beyond his distinguished flying cross. In 1949, The newly independent U.S. Air Force included a case study of the Jenkins Weave in its Air Tactical School curriculum. The case study emphasized not just the technique itself, but the institutional culture that had allowed it to be recognized and adopted. Air Force Major General Emmett O'Donnell, Jr., who had commanded the 33rd Fighter Group in World War II before leading bomber operations in Korea, commented, "The Jenkins Weave case teaches us that in warfare, good ideas can come from anywhere in the ranks. Our challenge as leaders is to create an organization that can recognize and implement those ideas quickly enough to make a difference." This lesson was institutionalized in various forms throughout the post-war military. The Army's after-action review process, the Navy's Naval Aviation Safety Program, and the Air Force's Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures publications all sought to capture and disseminate innovations from operational experience. On a personal level, Marcus Jenkins' wartime experience transformed his understanding of his own capabilities and his place in American society. In a letter to his parents written shortly after the Bremen raid, he expressed this transformation. "I did something yesterday that mattered, really mattered. Not just for myself or even for my crew, but for everyone in our formation. They're studying my technique now, talking about teaching it to other gunners. This is something they'll never be able to take away from me, no matter what happens after the war." This sentiment, achievement that could not be diminished by racial prejudice, was shared by many African-American veterans. Their service in World War II laid important groundwork for the civil rights movement that would follow. Having fought for democracy abroad, they returned determined to secure its promises at home. Jenkins became involved in civil rights activism in Detroit during the 1950s, working particularly on employment discrimination issues. His status as a decorated veteran and his professional position as an engineer gave him credibility in challenging discriminatory practices. He often cited his wartime experience when arguing against employment discrimination. "If I was good enough to defend this country at 26,000 feet over Germany, I'm good enough to work in any factory or office in Detroit." The technical aspects of Jenkins' innovation continued to interest military tacticians for years after the war. Analysis of gun camera footage and combat reports revealed that the effectiveness of the Jenkins Weave stemmed from several factors working in combination. 1. The psychological impact of seeing an unusual and unpredictable pattern of fire. 2. The actual increase in probability of hits due to the wider coverage area. 3. The disruption of German attack timing and coordination. 4. The visual reference point the tracers provided for other defensive gunners. A 1955 Air Force ballistic study determined that while the technique consumed ammunition at a higher rate, it increased the statistical probability of scoring at least some hits on attacking fighters by approximately 35%. More significantly, it reduced the accuracy of enemy fire by forcing attacking pilots to divide their attention between aiming their own weapons and evading the unpredictable patterns of defensive fire. The study concluded, "The primary value of the Jenkins Weave was not in increasing the bomber's offensive effectiveness, though it did this to some degree, but in degrading the attacker's performance at a critical moment. This represents an important principle in defensive combat. Sometimes disrupting the enemy's attack is more valuable than perfecting one's own." Kurt Wagner's final mission illustrated this principle perfectly. His attack run, which should have been devastating to the bomber formation, was thrown off just enough by Jenkins' unusual fire pattern to render it ineffective. The momentary disruption then created a vulnerability that led to his own demise. The lucky lady herself survived not just the Bremen mission, but the entire war. After completing 94 combat missions with various crews, she was returned to the United States in June 1945 and eventually scrapped as part of the rapid post-war drawdown of air assets. A section of her fuselage, bearing her name and mission tally, was preserved and eventually displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. In the museum display, a small plaque mentions the Bremen mission and Marcus Jenkins' innovative defensive technique. It represents one of the few public commemorations of his contribution to aerial warfare. Jenkins visited the museum in 1985 and was photographed next to this display for his hometown newspaper. The article, titled "Local Engineers' Wartime Innovation Still Remembered," brought his story to a new generation. In the accompanying interview, the 64-year-old Jenkins reflected, "It's strange to see your young self becoming history. That was a different world, a different America. We faced enemies abroad and discrimination at home. But we did our duty because we believed America could live up to its promises, even if it hadn't yet." This quiet patriotism, expressed despite the injustices he had faced, characterized many veterans of his generation and background. Their service represented not just duty to country as it was, but faith in what it could become. The tactical innovation that Jenkins introduced had implications beyond its immediate application in bomber defense. It represented a conceptual shift in thinking about aerial gunnery, from a paradigm focused on precision-aimed fire to one that incorporated area denial and psychological disruption. This shift paralleled broader developments in military thinking during and after World War II. Strategic bombing itself had evolved from early notions of precision against specific industrial targets toward area bombing designed to disrupt German industrial production and civilian morale more broadly. Jenkins' innovation at the tactical level mirrored this strategic evolution. Both moved from precision to disruption as organizing principles. The connection between tactical innovations like the Jenkins weave and larger strategic concepts illustrates how warfare evolves across multiple levels simultaneously. Individual adaptations on the battlefield both influence and are influenced by higher-level doctrinal thinking. For Kurt Wagner, the experienced ace who fell to this innovation, the outcome represented more than personal tragedy. It symbolized the Luftwaffe's inability to adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. German air doctrine remained relatively static despite mounting evidence of its diminishing effectiveness against evolving Allied tactics. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland later reflected on this institutional failure. "We knew our tactics needed to evolve, but our training system couldn't implement changes quickly enough. By 1944, we were losing experienced pilots faster than we could incorporate their insights into training new ones. The result was a force that became increasingly rigid in its approach, while the enemy became more adaptive." The contrast between American institutional adaptability and German rigidity emerged as one of the decisive factors in the air war. While individual German pilots remained highly skilled, their tactics and training failed to evolve as rapidly as the Allied approach. In this context, the Jenkins weave represented just one example of a broader pattern of Allied tactical evolution. Other innovations included the development of Zemke's fan fighter tactics by Colonel Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, the implementation of fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations, and the adoption of box-weaving escort patterns that maximized fighter coverage of bomber streams. Together, these tactical adaptations helped shift the air war decisively in the Allies' favor by mid-1944. The Bremen raid, where Jenkins downed Wagner, occurred during this pivotal period, when American air power was beginning to dominate the skies over Europe, but German resistance remained determined and dangerous. For Marcus Jenkins personally, the events over Bremen marked the beginning of a new chapter in his wartime service. His innovation brought him to the attention of senior officers, and he was occasionally pulled from regular combat duties to brief other gunners on his technique. These briefings took him to various 8th Air Force bases across East Anglia, where he demonstrated the weave using training equipment on the ground. During one such visit to RAF Dienethorpe in May 1944, Jenkins met Staff Sergeant William Wheeler, another African-American ball turret gunner. Wheeler had independently developed a variation of Jenkins' technique, using an asymmetrical figure-8 pattern that he found more effective against fighters attacking from oblique angles. Their meeting led to a refinement of the original Jenkins weave. The improved version, incorporating elements of Wheeler's variant, was officially adopted and taught to gunners preparing for the enormous air battles anticipated to accompany the coming invasion of France. This collaboration highlighted another aspect of tactical innovation in combat: the importance of knowledge sharing among practitioners. The formal military hierarchy, with its emphasis on top-down instruction, was supplemented by informal networks of combat veterans sharing experiences and techniques. These networks often proved more agile at disseminating practical knowledge than official channels. The refined Jenkins-Wheeler technique saw extensive use during the massive air operations supporting the D-Day landings. Though Luftwaffe opposition was lighter than expected over the beaches, bomber formations attacking targets deeper in France encountered determined resistance. Gunners employing the disruption technique reported its effectiveness in breaking up coordinated attacks by the depleted but still dangerous German fighter groups. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, mentioned the technique in his D-Day after-action report. Defensive gunnery innovations developed in recent months proved highly effective in countering enemy fighter attacks. The disruption patterns employed by our gunners frequently forced German pilots to break off their approaches before reaching optimal firing position. For Kurt Wagner's former squadron, Jagdgeschwader 27, the period following his loss over Bremen brought further attrition. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the unit had lost 40% of its pilots who had been present in April. Most were veterans with irreplaceable experience. Their replacements, though often brave and determined, lacked the thousands of flight hours that had made aces like Wagner so formidable. This pattern repeated across the Luftwaffe, creating what military historians later termed the experience spiral. As veteran pilots were lost, the average experience level of the force declined, leading to higher loss rates among newer pilots, further reducing the overall experience level, and so on in a destructive cycle. For the Lucky Lady and her crew, the remaining weeks of their combat tour brought further challenges but no losses. They participated in missions, supporting the D-Day landings, and struck targets throughout northern France. Marcus Jenkins employed his innovative technique in several subsequent engagements, though never again with the dramatic results of the Bremen raid. Upon completing their tour, the crew was rotated back to the United States, with most members assigned to training duties. Captain Holloway and Navigator Cohen both requested that Jenkins be assigned to their training unit, a testament to the respect he had earned. During his service as an instructor at Buckingham Army Airfield, Jenkins had the opportunity to formalize and refine his technique. Working with ballistics experts and tactical officers, he helped develop a systematic training approach that could be taught to new gunners within the limited hours available in the compressed wartime training schedule. The training materials acknowledged his contribution explicitly. The disruption fire technique developed by Sgt. Marcus Jenkins during combat operations over Europe represents an important supplement to traditional aimed fire methods. All gunners should be proficient in both approaches and understand when each is most appropriate. This formal recognition of his innovation was unusual for an enlisted serviceman, particularly an African American in the still segregated military. It reflected both the merit of his contribution and the gradual, halting progress toward recognition of African American service members' capabilities. The post-war period brought both opportunities and challenges for Jenkins and other African American veterans. The GI Bill offered educational benefits that many used to obtain previously unattainable degrees and professional qualifications. However, racial discrimination in housing, employment, and education remained pervasive. Jenkins' engineering career at General Motors represented a breakthrough that would have been unlikely without his wartime service and education benefits. Even so, he encountered barriers to advancement that his white colleagues did not face. His response was characteristic: patient persistence combined with unimpeachable professional performance. Our colleague from this period, Thomas Burns, later recalled, "Mark never complained about the obstacles he faced, but everyone knew they existed. He just outworked and outthought the system. When they couldn't promote him because of color, he'd file patents that the company couldn't ignore. When they kept him off important projects, he'd solve problems on his own time that made those projects succeed. Eventually, they had to recognize his contributions." By the 1960s, Jenkins had risen to senior engineering positions despite these barriers. His experience with the Jenkins weave, creating innovative solutions under pressure, had prepared him well for navigating the corporate world's challenges. He maintained contact with several members of the 332nd Fighter Group, including Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had witnessed and endorsed his innovation over Bremen. Their shared experience, proving their capabilities despite prejudice, created lasting bonds. The tactical principles behind the Jenkins weave continued to evolve in military doctrine, though the specific technique became obsolete with changing technology. The concept of disruption fire found new applications in helicopter door gunnery during the Vietnam War and in the development of aircraft self-protection systems that used chaff and flare patterns to disrupt enemy targeting. A 1968 Air Force Academy study on the evolution of aerial defense cited the Jenkins weave as a classic example of tactical innovation arising from battlefield necessity rather than formal development processes. The study emphasized the importance of creating institutional mechanisms to identify and propagate such innovations. What made the Jenkins weave significant was not just its effectiveness, but the system's ability to recognize and adopt it quickly. This responsiveness to bottom-up innovation remains essential to military effectiveness. Marcus Jenkins lived to see his contribution become part of military history. Before his death in 2003 at age 82, he participated in several oral history projects documenting the experiences of African American service members in World War II. In these interviews, he typically downplayed his individual contribution, emphasizing instead the collective achievement of his bomber crew and the broader significance of African American military service. In his final interview, recorded 6 months before his death, he reflected, "What I'm most proud of isn't shooting down some German pilot. It's that when my country needed new ideas, new approaches, they were willing to listen even to a black kid from Detroit. That gave me hope that America could change, could live up to its ideals. And in many ways, despite all our continuing problems, it has." The story of the Jenkins weave thus transcends its tactical significance. It represents a moment when innovation overcame both enemy skill and internal prejudice, when merit briefly triumphed over discrimination. In this sense, it encapsulates both the tragedy and the promise of African American service in World War II, fighting for a country that denied them full citizenship while demonstrating capabilities that would eventually help undermine the rationales for that denial. The legacy of Marcus Jenkins and others like him, African American service members who distinguished themselves despite serving in a segregated military, laid essential groundwork for the eventual desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. Their demonstrated competence and courage made maintaining separate and unequal treatment increasingly untenable. In the wider history of aerial warfare, the brief duel between Jenkins and Wagner represented the ongoing contest between offensive and defensive innovation that has characterized air combat since its inception. Each new offensive capability generates defensive countermeasures, which in turn prompt offensive adaptations. The Jenkins weave was one link in this continuous chain of tactical evolution. What made Jenkins' contribution remarkable was that it came from an unexpected source, an enlisted gunner with no formal tactical training, serving in a segregated military that often failed to recognize the full potential of all its members. His innovation demonstrated that effective tactics could emerge from practical experience rather than theory, and from anyone with the insight to question established doctrine when it proved inadequate. Kurt Wagner, the German ace who fell to this innovation, would likely have appreciated its elegance despite its fatal consequences for him. As a tactical innovator himself, he had developed several attack patterns used by his squadron. The difference was that Wagner operated within a system that increasingly lacked the institutional flexibility to adapt as circumstances changed, while Jenkins was fortunate to serve in a military that, despite its flaws, could still recognize and implement valuable innovations regardless of their source. Their brief fatal encounter 26, Saifu 0 feet above Bremen, thus represented more than a personal duel. It symbolized a larger contest between institutional cultures, one increasingly rigid and hierarchical versus one capable of learning and adapting even amid the chaos of war. The outcome of that larger contest, like the duel itself, would ultimately favor the more adaptable system. Today, military tacticians still study the Jenkins weave, not for its specific technique, which became obsolete with the jet age, but for the process by which it was developed and adopted. The case illustrates timeless principles about tactical innovation, the importance of empowering frontline personnel to experiment, the value of rapid feedback loops between combat experience and doctrine, and the need for institutional mechanisms to identify and disseminate valuable innovations. For Marcus Jenkins, the ball turret gunner, whose desperate improvisation became doctrine, the experience provided a confidence that sustained him through post-war challenges. As he wrote to Captain Holloway in 1948, during a period of professional setbacks, "When things get difficult, I remember Bremen. If I could figure out a solution up there, with fighters coming in and flak all around, I can surely solve these peacetime problems." The war taught us all that impossible situations often just need a new approach. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.